You're crouched by a hearth at the edge of a marsh. It's near the end of the last ice age, somewhere in what's now the Utah desert. And the fire's burned down to a bed of orange coals. A duck is roasting on a stick beside you. A spear tip rests in the sand, still warm from a hunt earlier that morning. The air smells like wood smoke and cold mud, and somewhere out past the firelight, the marsh is doing whatever a marsh does at the edge of an ice age. Frogs. Wind through reeds, the kind of quiet that isn't actually quiet at all. And in your other hand, you're holding a fistful of leaves that taste like punishment. Bitter, sharp, nothing close to food. You're about to drop them into the fire anyway. Lean in, breathe. Whatever you think you're picturing, it isn't a snack. Nobody crosses a marsh, fights through scrub, and hand selects the single nastiest plant in the wash because they're hungry. There was a duck. There was game. There was easier food 15 feet in any direction you'd care to walk. This wasn't about your stomach. This was about something happening behind your eyes. And on some level, you knew it before you ever struck the flint. If that sounds oddly familiar, it should. You've done a version of this exact thing more recently than you'd probably like to admit. A third cup of coffee you didn't need. A vape pulled out of a jacket pocket at 11 at night. An energy drink that tastes like a chemistry accident and costs $4. That one bitter green juice you choke down every morning for reasons that have nothing to do with how it tastes. None of it is nutrition. None of it would survive a taste test against literally anything else in the fridge. All of it is the same itch. Change what's happening in my head, on purpose right now. The hunter crouched at that fire wasn't a primitive version of you. He was you, with worse Wi-Fi and significantly better survival skills. Here's the story you've probably absorbed without ever being told it directly. Smoking is new. A few thousand years old, give or take. Something that started with tobacco in the Americas, got picked up by European sailors, and eventually turned into a habit. A small, pleasant vice for people who'd already settled down and had time on their hands. It's a reasonable thing to believe. Most general histories more or less say exactly that, and the timeline feels intuitive. People settle. People farm. People get bored. People invent ways to pass an evening. Smoking slots into that story, without friction. It even comes with a tidy origin point. Columbus's crew, in 1492, watching islanders inhale dried leaves through a tube, and writing home about it like they'd stumbled onto something brand new under the sun. Except the timeline doesn't survive contact with the dirt. Not by a little. By an entire geological era. For close to 2 centuries, the oldest physical proof anyone had of tobacco use was a set of smoking pipes pulled out of a riverbank in Alabama, holding on to trace nicotine, dated to roughly 3,300 years old. Old, sure. Old enough to predate the founding of Rome by a wide margin. But still comfortably inside the world of farming villages, pottery, settled life. A world where people had time to develop habits actually makes sense. Then a hearth in the Utah desert rewrote that number by 9,000 years. In 2015, a team digging at a site called Wishbone, out in the Great Salt Lake Desert, found something almost too small to notice. 4 charred seeds sitting inside an ancient fire pit. The lead archaeologist on the project, Darren Duke, ran the dating on the surrounding hearth material. The figure that came back, published in 2021 in the journal Nature Human Behavior, was 12,300 years old. Before the wheel existed anywhere on the planet. Before a single word had ever been written down by anyone, anywhere. Before tobacco itself had even been domesticated. That wouldn't happen for another 4,000 years, somewhere in South America. The people at that hearth weren't growing a mellow cultivated crop. They were walking out into the wild, finding Nicotiana attenuata, a genuinely brutal, bitter plant that evolved its bite specifically to poison insects. And choosing it anyway, on purpose. At the tail end of the Ice Age, while megafauna still walked the desert, someone decided the unpleasant plant was worth the trouble. That's not the origin story of a vice, that's the origin story of a technology. Here's what makes that choice make sense, chemically. Nicotine, by design, was never built for human enjoyment. Plants in the nightshade family produce it as a defense chemical, a neurotoxin engineered over millions of years to scramble the nervous systems of any insect that bites into the leaves. It does that by latching onto receptors built to receive a completely different signal, the one your own brain uses to regulate attention and mood. In an insect, that hijack is lethal. In a human, in the right dose, it's just enough of a jolt to register as a shift in consciousness. Focus sharpens. Mood lifts. The background noise in your head quiets down for a minute. The same molecule, the same lock, two completely different outcomes depending entirely on the size of the animal holding the leaf. What happened at that Utah hearth wasn't someone stumbling onto a treat. It was someone discovering that a substance engineered to disable a beetle could, in smaller doses, rearrange a human mind, and deciding that trade was worth making. At the time, it must have looked like setting fire to poison and leaning toward it anyway. That a hunter-gatherer band figured this out with zero chemistry, zero written record, and zero way of knowing what a receptor even was is the part worth sitting with. And here's the detail that's easy to miss. Nobody had to teach this. The behavior. Find the plant that messes with your head. Burn it. Breathe it in. Shows up again and again across the planet, in places with zero contact with each other and zero shared ancestry of the practice. Roughly 10,000 years after that desert hearth went cold, on the opposite side of the globe, in a cemetery carved into the Pamir Mountains of what's now Western China, mourners were doing something that rhymes with it exactly. Archaeologists excavating the Jirzankal cemetery found 10 wooden braziers, small burners holding stones scorched by intense heat, buried inside the tombs. When archaeologist Yimin Yang ran chemical analysis on the residue, the braziers came back loaded with cannabis, and not the mild kind. The THC concentration was unusually high, consistent with plants either sought out at high altitude or deliberately cultivated for strength. To check the find wasn't a fluke, the team compared it against cannabis remains from a different cemetery, 1,000 miles east, from roughly the same period. And that hemp showed none of the same chemical signature. Two sites, same general era, two completely different relationships with the same plant. The burials at Jirzankal date to roughly 2,500 years ago, in a community most likely tied to nomadic Scythian or Sogdian peoples, moving along what would later become the Silk Road. These weren't recreational smoke breaks. The braziers sat inside burial chambers, beside a Chinese harp, beside skeletal remains that show signs of trauma sustained near the time of death. Whatever was happening at those funerals, the smoke wasn't incidental to it. It was central, woven into the same ceremony as the music and whatever else took place in that chamber before the tomb was sealed. And in that same general window of history, the Greek historian Herodotus, writing from the complete other side of the known world, recorded in his histories, without ever having set foot anywhere near the Pamirs, that a nomadic people called the Scythians threw cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside felt tents and breathed in what rose off them. Two cultures separated by an entire continent. No contact between the source of the archaeology and the source of the text. The same idea, arriving from two directions at once. Move forward again, into Mesoamerica, and the smoke stops being only ritual and starts becoming mythology. The Maya smoked tobacco rolled into cigar-like bundles, and they didn't treat it as a minor habit. They built it directly into their cosmology. One of their gods is shown in surviving art with a lit cigar tucked into his own headdress, as a permanent attribute, the same way other gods carry a particular weapon or animal. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiche Maya, two hero twins are thrown into a pitch-black underworld chamber and ordered to keep their cigars burning through the whole night or be killed at dawn. They cheat. They tie fireflies to the tips and let the glow pass for lit tobacco in the dark. A carved panel at the Temple of the Cross in Palenque shows a figure smoking an elaborate pipe, and chemists have since confirmed actual nicotine residue inside a Maya flask roughly 1,300 years old, centuries before any European ship ever reached these shores. The word itself outlived the empire. Linguists trace the modern word cigar back through the Spanish cigarro to a Maya term, sicar, meaning roughly to smoke rolled tobacco. An entire civilization was colonized and rewritten, and a fragment of its vocabulary for this one specific act survived anyway, riding inside a word people use every day without knowing where it came from. Smoke, in the Maya worldview, wasn't decoration. It was a substance that could move between the world of the living and the underworld, a kind of breath that crossed boundaries nothing else could. And if you want the cleanest proof that this wasn't one idea spreading outward from a single source, go to the one continent that had no land bridge to any of it. Aboriginal Australians, isolated from the rest of the world for tens of thousands of years, independently found their own nicotine-bearing plant, a shrub called Duboisia hopwoodii, known as pituri, and built an entire trade economy around it. Traders carried it hundreds of miles on foot across some of the harshest desert on the continent in exchange for tools, ochre, and weapons. And communities developed strict rules around who was allowed to harvest it, prepare it, and pass it on. This wasn't a casual habit. It was a regulated, valuable good. People chewed it mixed with alkaline ash to pull the nicotine loose faster, carried it as a stay against hunger and fatigue on journeys that could stretch for days through country with no reliable water, and burned it as an anesthetic during initiation ceremonies. The earliest written record of the practice comes from the naturalist Joseph Banks, who watched it happen on the eastern coast in 1770 and had no idea what he was looking at. When the explorers Burke and Wills tried pituri themselves nearly a century later, they described the effect as something like 2 pretty stiff nobblers of brandy. Same molecule the Wishbone hunters were after 12,000 years earlier, on a continent they never reached. Same impulse. Arrived at completely independently. Here's the part most coverage of this topic skips entirely, though. You'd assume, after all this, that the human body must be specially built for inhaling smoke. That evolution handed us some biological shortcut, some built-in armor, that made the whole practice easier than it should be. It's a tidy assumption. It's also, depending on which paper you read, not really true. For a while, scientists thought exactly that. A 2016 study out of Penn State found a mutation in a gene called AHR that's unique to modern humans, and argued it gave us up to 1,000-fold better tolerance for smoke toxins than Neanderthals ever had. Clean story. Humans got the upgrade, Neanderthals didn't, case closed. A separate team at Leiden University ran the comparison again with a wider set of genes, and found close to the opposite. Neanderthals, it turns out, carried more protective gene variants than we do. Our own ability to break down smoke toxins has been quietly declining since before agriculture existed. Already visible in a single genome 45,000 years old, tens of thousands of years before the first farmer anywhere planted a seed. Researchers studying our broader exposure to ancient toxins have floated a strange possible upside to that decline. That some of the same genetic machinery may now help certain people tolerate modern smoke exposure later in life. But even that's framed as a leftover, not a built-in advantage. Nobody in this field claims humans were designed for the habit. So, the smoking didn't spread because human lungs were built for it. It spread in spite of that. Bodies worse equipped than a Neanderthal's, choosing the smoke anyway, generation after generation, on 5 different continents, with 5 different plants. That's not biology pulling the strings from behind the scenes. That's a decision people kept making, on purpose, regardless of the cost, for reasons that clearly mattered more than the cost did. None of this, in the end, was really about the plant. It was about needing a way to step outside the ordinary version of yourself for a few minutes, usually with somebody else standing close enough to share it. You've felt the shape of that, even if you've never lit anything in your life. Think about the last time you stepped outside a wedding, an office, a family dinner with one other person, just to get some air, and ended up having the one real conversation of the entire night, the one that actually mattered, the one you'd remember a year later. And the small talk inside the room, you wouldn't. Or the way a candle gets lit at a funeral, or incense at a temple. And for a second, the room agrees to be a slightly different kind of room. Or the specific, almost sacred pause of stepping onto a balcony with one other person at a party that's gotten too loud. The smoke break didn't invent that feeling. It just gave it a reason to exist, a few minutes carved out of the schedule where the normal rules of the room don't quite apply. That's the same hinge the Wishbone hunters were using 12,000 years ago, minus the packaging and the warning label. A deliberate crossing into a slightly altered, slightly more honest space, taken together. You don't need the nicotine, or the THC, or any of it, to recognize the shape. Every culture that ever built a ritual around smoke, a funeral, a ceremony, the plain modern habit of 2 co-workers stepping out at the same moment, was reaching for the same thing. A few minutes of altered air, shared with someone, away from whatever the rest of the day demanded. That instinct is at least 12,000 years old. The version of it you're carrying around right now is just wearing different packaging. There's no clean moral here, and there doesn't need to be one. The instinct showed up in too many disconnected places, too many unrelated centuries, on too many continents that never once spoke to each other, to be a mistake anyone made. It's just apparently one of the oldest things we do. So here's what I actually want to know. What's the modern version of that fireside moment in your own life? The thing you do with someone else, specifically to step outside the ordinary version of the day for a few minutes?